Hey Modern fans, this is Nikachu, Merfolk Master, and today is Masters Monday, where we are going to go in depth on masters of their archetypes. I'm interviewing masters of Modern, and if you want to learn the insights to their deck, you're going to want to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Today's special guest, he is another master of Death Shadow. He has written guides on Jund Death Shadow, guides on Mardu Death Shadow, Grixis Death Shadow. He won Grand Prix Toronto 2019. I would like to very much thank our special guest today, Michael Rapp. Thanks for coming on to the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So Michael, you're a specialist in Death Shadow. And we spoke with Ben Jones. He's a partner in crime with Ben Jones, another Death Shadow specialist. But we already talked about Grixis Death Shadow. And I would love to know more about the other versions of Death Shadow. We're talking Mardu, Jund, the Traverse versions. And so hopefully today we're going to learn quite a bit about that from you. But before we go too far into Death Shadow, why don't you let us know basically who you are, what are your accomplishments with Death Shadow for people who are meeting you for the first time?
Awesome. As you said, my name is Michael. I'm a Magic player. I'm from just north of Boston. I started playing in 2015 was my first Grand Prix. I won GP Toronto in February with Grixis Shadow. I won a PTQ over the summer during Hogak Summer with Mardu Shadow.
Ooh, that's impressive.
I'm currently putting a lot of work into various 4-color builds of the deck, actually. So we got some exciting things coming down the pipeline.
Excellent. That's fantastic. So, in your opinion, why should people be playing Death Shadow? What are the advantages of this deck?
If you're a person that likes to play fair Magic or interactive Magic, I think Death Shadow is the premier deck in the format to do so. Something that a lot of the Jund and blue-white decks struggle with is they can't close quickly, so the potency of their disruption falls off in the late game. You know, if you draw Thoughtseize on turn 5 or whatever, it might not be nearly as effective as turns 1 or 2. But you don't have the closing speed necessary to prevent those things from happening. Once you start playing threats like Death Shadow and Gurmag Angler, you can shut the door a lot faster.
And it sounds like those late game Thoughtseize actually still add value in some ways, because it can help grow your Death Shadow at the very least.
Yes, they can. They certainly can.
So that's excellent. That's a good reason why to be playing Death Shadow over, say, something like Jund. Very similar looking decks. So maybe we should now talk about why Jund Shadow? Why Traverse? Why Mardu Shadow? Indulge us. Let us know what is the difference between these variations of Death Shadow, and how do they have an advantage over Grixis Death Shadow?
So Grixis is most potent when there is a powerful combo deck in the format, because Stubborn Denial is the most efficient counterspell you can have in Modern. Jund Shadow is the most aggressive of the Shadow builds, and the least impacted by something like Humans, which traditionally is a tough Shadow matchup, almost exclusively because of Reflector Mage being brutal on Gurmag Angler. When instead of Gurmag Angler you have something like Tarmogoyf, that downside isn't nearly as bad. And Mardu Shadow is the Shadow deck that grinds the best out of the three, with cards like Ranger Captain of Vios finding another threat in Death Shadow, Path to Exile being universal removal spell, a higher discard count with generally 8 copies of Thoughtseize Inquisition, and then even dipping into things like Tide Hollow Sculler.
Grixis Death Shadow didn't have any presence really in the Hogak era or the Hogak Summer metagame. What is it about Mardu Shadow that a lot of people were gravitating to, including I can't remember the pro's name off the top of my head. Jacob Wilson. He was gravitated to Mardu Shadow. What was it about Mardu that gave it the edge over Grixis Death Shadow during Hogak Summer?
It was almost entirely Path to Exile. Grixis Shadow had no good way to deal with Hogak itself, let alone permanently dealing with things like Vengevine or Bloodghast. So that it sounds silly, but like I said, it was almost entirely Path to Exile.
And there was no good like Esper Shadow list, or maybe there was, and it wasn't just nearly as popular.
You needed red for Temur Battle Rage in order to be able to close those games against Hogak quickly.
Right.
Because the matchup dynamic there was you were still going to get overwhelmed by things like Bloodghast and Vengevine.
Mm-hmm.
But you could turn that very quickly with a Death Shadow and a TBR.
Right. Very important. So what kind of combo decks are we talking about that are prevalent right now that makes Grixis Death Shadow so good that if they were to disappear, something like Jund or Mardu would take Grixis's place?
So there isn't really a great combo deck right now per se. I do think Grixis Shadow is a slight favorite against a lot of the Simic Urza decks, which is certainly a boon.
Mm-hmm.
But it also fields good matchups against... I think the Burn matchup was very popular for a while, and experienced Death Shadow pilots would often have a slight edge in that matchup depending on deck building. There was a while where I bumped up the number of Collective Brutalities I had in my deck just to give myself a couple of extra points against that.
Mm-hmm.
Amulet Titan. That was the deck I was trying to think of. For the longest time, Death Shadow has had a very good Amulet Titan matchup since they stopped playing things like... what's the red-green land? Grove of the Burn Willows.
Right.
So a lot of the prominent Amulet players were very, very worried about the Death Shadow matchup, but couldn't really find a reason to switch back to the red-green build as opposed to the build that splashes white for things like Path to Exile.
Mm-hmm.
So that matchup got pretty easy as well as pretty popular. I think you could build your deck to be reasonably good against the Tron deck, but Eldrazi Tron certainly is another story entirely. That matchup is very difficult.
For all variations of Shadow?
Mardu likely has the easiest time, just again because Path is a unilateral removal spell.
Mm-hmm.
Jund has a probably medium time because Tarmogoyf is good against that deck, but
4 or 5 Tarmogoyf still
Shadow...
good against Thought Not Seer.
Yeah, so Tarmogoyf is often a 5/6 in that matchup, so it can tangle with Reality Smasher as well. But the reason that matchup is tough for Shadow decks is because they get to play 3-ish copies of Blast Zone.
Yeah.
So while Tarmogoyf is strong against a lot of their creatures, they can still deal with Tarmogoyf efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
With Blast Zone. They're often also playing a couple copies of Dismember now. So if you try to get a turn 2 Tarmogoyf on the table or whatever to try to set up, oftentimes early stages in the game like that, it is a 3/4, 4/5.
Mm-hmm.
So a well-timed Dismember can be kind of backbreaking as well.
Maybe before we go too further, what do you think are the most competitive variations of Death Shadow that are not Grixis?
Right now, I think it is one of the 4-color builds.
Mm-hmm.
We've started to see those pop up a little bit. They're primarily like a bug deck splashing red.
Right. For Temur Battle Rage.
Yep, and sideboard cards here and there. Kolaghan's Command is a really good sideboard card right now.
Mm-hmm.
And those decks have taken a couple different forms. Some are playing Gurmag Angler and Thought Scour. Some are playing Tarmogoyf and Traverse. It just kind of depends on where you want your points. The Tarmogoyf Traverse lists are a little more consistent, but they're a little slower. Their ceiling isn't necessarily as high, but their floor is a little higher. So they run a little closer to the middle,
Hmm.
while the Angler Thoughtscour versions are a little spikier, like Peak and Valley type thing.
Right.
But the way Modern operates right now, that might be what you have to do. You might have to play the deck with the high ceiling as opposed to the high floor, just to be able to compete with the variety of different strategies in the format.
It sounds like a spectrum between the Jund Death Shadow variants and the Grixis Death Shadow variants, and then you can get like something in between those two.
Yeah, there's also another four color version around there that is Jund based splashing blue for Stubborn Denial and like Okos out of the sideboard.
Oh yeah.
So that's another direction you could go with the deck if you wanted a slightly more aggressive as opposed to a version with a couple more cantrips.
Where would you bring in Oko? Because I mean, of course, Oko has a lot of abilities on it, but gaining life is not exactly the thing that Death Shadow players want to do.
So on the surface, it's not what we want to do. And to be honest, its plus ability is the worst ability in a lot of matchups for us.
All right.
But for example, matchups where you're going to get raced, like Burn, is a good place to bring it in. Um, another good and popular matchup is Eldrazi
Mm-hmm.
because you get to just blunt the effectiveness of all of their creatures. Right, their game plan is, you know, play a 4/4 on 2 and a 5/5 on 3. But suddenly, if those things are 3/3s, they're a lot less intimidating.
Right. Right.
It's also fine against the Urza decks as an answer to things like Ensnaring Bridge. It can shut down Emery. It can shut down Urza.
That's right.
It's not the best card there, but it does a lot of things.
Turn Urza into an elk.
Yeah, it can shut down like the Emery engine. If they have to run out a Thopter Foundry or something, you can deal with that.
All right. So it does a little bit of everything.
Yeah, it's also just a card with an absurdly high power level. And I think if you're playing colors that are blue and green or even adjacent to blue and green, you should do your best to try to get it into the deck. I'm sure, you've even looked at it for Merfolk.
Oh yeah, it's putting up a lot of published results right now for Simic Merfolk. It's been a really good game changer, mostly because Merfolk has a lot of problems with artifacts that are permanents, namely Ensnaring Bridge, and this is just some card that not only is good against Ensnaring Bridge, but it's good against Control. It's good against mid-range decks, like you said. It's good against Death Shadow. Turn your Death Shadow
Yeah,
into a 3/3.
it certainly is a problem for my side of things as well. But even as like a weird Bitter Blossom, it's just a very powerful card. Like as you mentioned, it's good against mid range. It's good against control. Just making a 3/3 every other turn is something that is hard for those decks to deal with.
Yeah, oddly enough, recurring source of damage, and sometimes you just trade
Yeah.
with something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is Oko is impossible to kill in combat, so you don't really have to worry about that, which forces them to spend like a real spell on it, whether it's a detention sphere or something like that,
Hmm.
or an abrupt decay that isn't hitting, a Death Shadow or a Merfolk Lord or something along those lines. I mean, even decks like Infect are picking it up. Obviously, it's a 4 of in the Simic Urza deck, which is um, one of the best decks in the format.
So I spoke with you some weeks ago, and you said you've been working a little bit. I can't remember if it was just any general Traverse build or a Jund build in today's metagame. Uh, what was it about what's happening right now in Modern that might pull somebody to the non Grixis version of Death Shadow?
Um, so one of the ways that you can beat up on decks like Eldrazi and Urza is to get underneath them. and a slightly more aggressive build of the deck, featuring things like Tarmogoyf and Gore-Clan Rampager, can let you do that.
Right.
Also, Grixis has a lot of highs and lows. One of its primary issues is not being able to find threats in all of the games. And obviously, in a game where you don't find a threat, you can't win. Where the Traverse builds have the same number of actual threats, but Traverse gives you a higher artificial threat density.
Right.
So if riding the highs and lows of not being able to find a threat, or just wanting to be more aggressive and less interactive is something that you're interested in, you might want to look into the Traverse builds as opposed to Grixis.
So why isn't it we're not seeing enough of those Traverse builds, and basically Grixis Shadow is like all over the map? Is it just a means of popularity, or is there strategically it's just not quite there right now?
I think there are certainly times when Jund is better and when Grixis is better. I think that the people that are looking to pick up Death Shadow are people that are always looking to play the interactive decks, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people that want to play Jund, the people that want to play Blue-White Control, that want to be able to kind of maneuver and influence decisions in the game. And I do think Grixis gives you a better opportunity to do that because you have a higher density of instance, where the Jund version is more sorcery heavy. You're playing things like more sorcery speed discard spells. You're playing things like Traverse, which is a sorcery, which means that you're cutting back on things like Snapcaster Mage and Stubborn Denial, Thought
Mm-hmm.
Scour, things that really give you a lot of mobility within the game. And I think people are attracted to that more than anything when they think about Death Shadow.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. The I'm also wondering, does the presence of Grixis Shadow make it hard to play another Shadow deck? Because at least from my point of view, just looking at the deck lists, it looks like Grixis interacts very well against, say, a Jund Death Shadow list, but a Jund Shadow list doesn't look like it interacts very well with a Grixis Shadow list. Things like, Fatal Push, Tarfire may not get you there against Tasigur and, basically, sorry, not Tasigur, Gurmag Angler. Whereas the Grixis Shadow list might have more tools against the Jund list. Like Fatal Push definitely kills Tarmogoyf, for example.
Yeah, so I think before, I think some number of weeks ago that was true. I think since the printing of Veil of Summer, Grixis got hit very hard in the Grixis versus non-blue Shadow Mirrors.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jund and 4-color all get to play a bunch of Veil of Summers in their sideboard, which makes the Grixis Shadow player's life a lot harder. That being said, from the non-blue side, you do actually get access to more Answers to Gurmag Angler, which is traditionally, at least in the Grixis mirror, the hardest threat to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the high number of things like Fatal Push in the deck.
Yeah.
So getting access to cards like Assassin's Trophy is a big swing in that matchup. But if the matchup becomes about, like, if the matchup gets to the point where Snapcaster removal spell or Snapcaster Kolaghan's command or Kolaghan's return Snapcaster, it can certainly get harder for the non-blue Shadow decks, but especially since the printing of things like Oko and Veil of Summer, Grixis has certainly lost some of those percentage points in the matchup.
That's a good point. I don't know how much Grixis really has gained over the last few years, but like the Traverse builds have gained a lot. They did gain Assassin's Trophy, they did gain Veil of Summer, which is now banned in Pioneer and Standard. So I mean, this is a super powerful card. They gained Oko. Did they ever try to fool around with Once Upon a Time, or was Traverse just way too much better?
So in my latest four color builds, and in a lot of other four color builds you'll see running around, um, people are actually running 2 to 3 copies of Once Upon a Time.
So why 2 to 3 copies? Why not the full four like most lists try to jam?
So I think there is a detriment. So Shadow typically runs on a low land count, 17 or 18 lands.
Hmm.
Um, so while the first copy is very powerful if you can cast it for free, drawing that card in the mid game when you have to pay the 2 mana for, what is full retail on that card can be a little difficult. It can make some of your turns
Right.
pretty awkward. I think it is better. I I lean to 3 copies, maybe 4 copies, um, in the four-color builds that play Traverse and Gurmag Angler, because you have a higher instant density to make the impact of drawing that card later in the game not as bad, because you have more options going into your opponent's turn. But in sorcery speed builds, like the Jund-based four-color decks, or even just Jund itself, you lose a lot of that uh, maneuverability within the game. So you tend to favor a smaller number of those, especially because those decks tend to play, 3 or 4 copies of Traverse the Uvenwald. So you're not really reliant on having a free Once Upon a Time to be able to find a threat.
Hmm. Yeah,
They
Traverse
kind
is
of just
basically like a cheaper version of Once Upon a Time from turns one and on. Where I don't know,
uh
maybe more than maybe a bit further than that.
yeah, that's the struggle of the Traverse decks, is if you can't turn on Delirium, Traverse is not a very good magic card at all. Which is one of the reasons that Once Upon a Time made it into the deck. Those decks used to play, a reasonably high density of cards like Manamorphose in
Hmm.
order to try to get instant into the graveyard. And Manamorphose is really not a very good magic card when you're not playing things like Arclight Phoenix or Thing in the Ice,
Right, right.
or Storm. Having a real spell-based payoff for that card is a requirement to make it a good card,
Hmm.
um, which those Traverse Shadow decks just don't have. They just need an instant that isn't a removal spell that they can reliably put in the graveyard.
It's hard to make Manamorphose fair. We've talked about that many
Yeah,
times on this show. It's hard to make Manamorphose fair.
yeah. Jun Shadow's doing the Lord's work in that regard.
um. So if you go in the Jun Shadow direction, in general, what are its good matchups? What are its bad matchups?
I think that its good matchups are right now. I think it has a good matchup against other Shadow decks. I think that it has a good matchup against. It has a better matchup against Eldrazi Tron. I think it has an even-ish matchup against Simic Urza. I think it has a reasonably good Humans matchup. Its burn matchup is worse than Grixis, but still likely pretty even.
Hmm.
Its bad matchups are things like Jund and Blue-White Control, um, things that are going to be heavily interactive, because you lose out on things like Stubborn Denial, as a way to be able to protect your creatures.
Right, right. And those decks are still around. I'm seeing a lot of mid range pop up.
Yeah, the metagame is trending in an interesting way, because the mid-range decks are starting to pop up again. So it was funny. The Urza decks, back when they were more combo-oriented, when they were like paradoxical outcome versions,
Yeah.
Shadow popped up to beat up on those decks because that matchup was quite good. And then the Urza deck shifted more towards this, you know, Simic Oko build
Yeah, Simic
that
Oko.
is less combo that is less combo centric. And that matchup got a little worse for the Death Shadow decks, but it was still, I think, slightly in Shadow's favor. And as the Shadow decks got more and more popular and Humans was on the decline, I think decks like Jund and Eldrazi Tron kind of picked up, to try to prey on the Shadow decks.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So we're kind of like coming full circle there.
Yeah, exactly. Were there any other cards that came up recently from Throne of Eldraine that got adopted into these shadow variants?
The big ones obviously are Oko, Once Upon a Time. Veil of Summer isn't Eldraine, but it's, from that era.
Yeah.
Trying to think of Eldraine specific cards. You'll see cards like, so one thing that's very interesting with Traverse is adventure creatures. And I'm not sure any of them are good enough to be unanimously in these shadow decks. But when Throne was getting previewed, I was testing things like one Bone Crusher Giant and one Murderous Rider as removal spells that you could tutor for.
Yeah,
because you could never really do that before. Like, some people played like a Shriekmaw. But obviously when, something like Death Shadow is big, you don't want a removal spell that can't kill black creatures.
Right.
So if you can tutor for Murderous Rider instead, that is a big change, especially when things like Oko are running around.
Yeah, you can kill the creatures and you kill planeswalkers.
Yeah, and you just get a body on the backside if you need it.
Yeah. These adventure spells are very, very interesting. Really good design, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's actually a mechanic that when I first looked at, I was like, I don't know how much I like this. But it has certainly got a lot better over... it has grown on me since the set has been out.
Me too. Use adventure side of the spell, and now my creature is safe from your Inquisition of Kozileks and Thoughtseizes.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't Thoughtseize what's exiled.
Unfortunately, no. I'll have to look into what's that card from Eldraine? Memory Theft?
Yeah, maybe.
These adventure creatures get too out of hand.
So, what is it about So we saw a little bit of Mardu Shadow during the Hogak era. And we understand that, Hogak got banned. So maybe there was less of a need for Path to Exile. Was there anything about the bannings of Faithless Looting and the unbanning of Stoneforge Mystic that maybe changed people to move to Grixis Shadow over the other builds?
So I think that Mardu is the best Shadow deck against the Stoneforge Mystic decks.
Okay.
Just because you get to play a high... Mardu Shadow typically runs around 20 lands, like 1920, as opposed to 1718. So it can support more copies of things like Kolaghan's Command, which is the best card against Stoneforge Mystic, I think.
Oh yeah, sure. Do all that work to try to get that artifact in play and just blow it up.
Yeah, and you get to kill the Stoneforge.
Yeah. 2 birds, 1 stone.
I think that the soft banning of Arclight Phoenix certainly hurt the deck, because, now Path to Exile is a less attractive removal spell, where it was once, I don't want to say staple, but it was a big draw to play the deck.
It was a premium card.
I think Hogak was as dominant as it was, obviously because its power level is incredibly high, but because people never really adopted Path to Exile as an answer to it. You saw these blue-white control decks, but they can't capitalize on Path to Exile, right? They can Path to Exile your Hogak, but they can't do anything after that, and they give you time to set up. Whereas the Mardu Shadow decks could have the Path to Exile, and a lot of their creatures were actually surprisingly bad at blocking.
Oh yeah, I totally feel you. Merfolk, if they couldn't kill my Merfolk, I very easily attacked through everything. The only thing that really blocked was Hogak.
Yeah. So if you could solve the Hogak issue or like the Vengevine issue, then that deck wasn't very good without those cards.
Bloodcast
doesn't block. And in a lot of situations,
Carrion Feeder doesn't block.
Yeah, so it was like Hogak, Vengevine, and like Stitcher Supplier were like the only cards that could block.
Yeah.
And if you could deal with the Hogak, especially the turn 2 Hogak draws, they would often have to go all in. And if you were able to path the Hogak, they would end up with like 1 or 2 cards in their graveyard and like a Stitcher's Supplier and a Bloodghast in play.
Yeah.
Like, suddenly that deck doesn't sound very good, right?
Maybe everyone should have been adopting Path at that time.
Yeah, so I think that Path was at an all-time low, and I think that the combination of Path plus Clock was only really available in Mardu Shadow.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that sounds very good. So, let's say someone was... One cool thing about Modern is that you can adapt your deck over time, given the state of the metagame.
Yep.
Would you, in your opinion, talking to Death Shadow players out there, would it be enough to commit to a particular version of Death Shadow? Is it flexible? Like, is Jund Death Shadow or any Traverse version of Death Shadow flexible enough to change with the ever-changing, ever-evolving state of Modern? Or do you have to be open to play all versions of Death Shadow between Grixis and the other versions?
So I think that the most evergreen version is the Grixis version.
Okay.
Grixis Shadow might wax and wane a little bit, but it is always, at a minimum, a good deck.
Mm-hmm.
I think of the other versions, Jund is the closest to that. However, I think these 4-color versions also have a ton of play. I think Mardu needs a specific specific metagame in order to really succeed, but it is always, again, a deck that is fine to play. We even saw some of it popping up here and there a couple of weeks ago in Moto events. I forget if they were challenges or PTQs, but as recent as 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a couple of Mardu Shadow decks putting up results here and there as the metagame tends to slow down a little bit. As you talked about, there's those Jund decks popping up again, and that those are the kind of metagames where Mardu Shadow excels.
Is it just because of Path Exile?
No, I think Ranger Captain of Eos and Unearth have a lot to do with having a good Jund match.
Oh, so it gives it a lot of grind.
Yeah, so if you can like Ranger Captain of Eos for Death Shadow, suddenly you have, like, a 3/3 might not sound like a real body, but it's something that they do have to answer at some point.
Yeah, it's something you got to spend that Fatal Push on that thing.
Yeah, and then if you ever get to Unearth a Ranger Captain, like, Jund is just way behind.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we see former Mardu Pyromancer Master Selphisic, he's adopted the Mardu Shadow list. He doesn't want to let go of Mardu, so he's sticking with Mardu. He just adds Death Shadow. Yeah. And, he's still in, like, the top 20 of the leaderboard on Magic the Gathering Online. So, yeah, he's definitely helping contribute to the results even today.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually played against Selfie the other day. And I was like, oh, I bet he's on Mardu Pyromancer because he's been playing that deck forever. And then he cycled a Street Wraith on turn 1, and I was like, okay, I was wrong.
Yeah, they banned Faithless Looting. He just replaced the 1-drop with Death Shadow.
Yeah. I mean, it's always good to see people like Selfie that are, constantly playing Moto pick up the deck, because it does help it get refined. And, the more people playing the deck, the happier I am.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I'm sure you're the same way with Merfolk, right? Where you just want the community to grow and develop and foster itself, and the more people you have, the easier that is.
And the more options available, the more variations that can be to a wider variety of tastes in the community.
Yeah, and, like, if the community is small, like, I have a bunch of ideas. I know that I personally don't have time to test all of them. But if I'm talking to people in Discord and I talk about the ideas that I have, there are people that will go out and play a few leagues with it and come back and be like, hey, this is what I found playing this version of the deck. Maybe we can refine it this way. And honestly, it is both great to see that and a great help to have that.
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's excellent to have that sort of community team, working around the clock for making the deck better.
Yeah, and that, as people that are very devoted to a deck, you and I both always want the deck to be as good as it can be.
Absolutely, no matter what the variation is. I never liked Simic Merfolk for forever, and now Simic is good, so I played it, at least for half a year now.
Yeah, there was a long time where I loved Grixis Shadow, I still do, but branching out to play some of these 4-color versions has been a ton of fun.
So, speaking about these 4-color versions, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that people make with them?
The biggest mistake I see in Shadow decks in general is people cycling Street Wraith without a reason to.
Oh yeah, okay. Tell us more about that.
So, the number one thing I see is people cycling Street Wraith on the end step. I just can't think of a reason to do that unless your opponent has put something on the stack that you need to do.
Right.
Otherwise, it is almost universally better to just draw your card and have more information for when you have to make that decision. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you're trying to enable a Death Shadow that you have, or trying to enable a Gurmag Angler that you have, or a Traverse that you have, go ahead and cycle it. That is, a valid reason to do so. But people just firing them off in seemingly random spots just to draw a card is one of the bigger mistakes. Because if you don't have to, you can hold it and give yourself the option to draw something like a Mishra's Bauble, and then draw, if you like the card off Mishra's Bauble and you want to play it that turn, you can cycle your Street Wraith to get that card,
right?
And not have to wait until the next turn. So it's like everything else in Magic. You don't want to do things without a good reason to, or until you have to.
And if you cycle it, you take away any chance of casting it.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know how often that happens, but it does happen. Boom, 3/4 creature, Swamp Walk, protection from Fatal Push.
You'd be surprised, against like Jund, I do that all the time.
Yeah, there you go.
I actually joke about it being True Name Nemesis.
It might as well be. Protection from Fatal Push, protection from Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, can't die to Abrupt Decay.
Protection from Abrupt Decay. Cannot be blocked by anything. Unblockable creature. Yeah. Attacks for 3.
It is funny when people joke about casting True Name Nemesis, but it does come up. Especially the Shadow Mirrors too.
Yeah, true story. So is there any other pretty common mistakes that people make with these sort of shadow lists?
The other one is a more hard to pin down one, and it's role assessment. People are often very aggressive with their life total, mm-hmm. When you don't always have to be. There are some matchups, like against humans and Devoted Druid and even Merfolk, stuff like that, where Death Shadow is the control deck.
Mm-hmm.
And, running your life total down in order to get a shadow out can often lead to you getting killed by, a surprise Mantis Rider, or a surprise, Merfolk Lord, or, something of that variety.
Surprise, a Merfolk Lord.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of those matchups, you're supposed to be conservative, but people are like, oh my god, I have to get my threat in play, I have to do this. When in reality, that isn't the case. And I don't think a lot of people that are newer to the deck really understand role assessment in all of the matchups. And if you don't, and you're reckless with your life total, it can very easily get you killed. Same thing with Burn. I think a lot of people playing the Burn matchup struggle at first because they are trying to race the burn deck, when in reality you're playing like a weird balancing act in that matchup.
So, when you're playing the control deck, I mean, do you still have your Death Shadows in the deck?
You do, because you do still need to kill them, and those decks are going to do damage to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the burn deck will definitely do damage to you one way or another.
Yeah, the burn deck will do damage to you. Like, the Merfolk deck still has to attack you to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
Humans also has to attack you to kill you. So you're in a spot where you can afford to wait as long as you can control how the game is being played.
Right.
The important thing is never letting Merfolk have Island Walk, because you just die. And the same is true with, like, humans, right? You have to kill... Humans is more about killing everything than Merfolk is, because their creatures tend to get bigger a little faster, due to things like Thalia's Lieutenant and the nature of Champion of the Parish and such.
Yep.
And the burn deck is like a weird balancing act where the secret to that matchup is you have to be able to pressure the burn player's resources, otherwise they won't move. And if they don't move, they just get to sit and stockpile spells in their hand, and eventually they get to go like end step, burn spell, untap, burn spell, and kill you. But if you can do things like Inquisition of Kozilek them, or Kolaghan's Command to like kill their creature and make them discard a card, or Collective Brutality, escalated to 2 or 3 modes, that puts a lot of strain on that deck's resources. And once they're low on resources, they have to just try to kill you before you find a way to kill them.
Yeah.
That way, you make them enable your Death Shadows for you. As opposed to the burn player's objective in that matchup being let you do the work to turn on your Death Shadows, and then that makes their job, twice as easy.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, so you can finish.
And a lot of that is true of the other aggressive creature matchups as well. You kind of just have to sit back and play like a Fatal Push, Snapcaster, Fatal Push kind of game until you're ready to deploy a threat and turn the corner. But a lot of newer players don't really understand it.
Can you still take a control route or a control role with these traverse builds?
You can. It's a little harder because you don't have things like Snapcaster Mage, which is one of the biggest benefits in that kind of game plan. But you gain access to other control elements. You gain access to things like Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy. Kolaghan's Command is in both shells, but the Jund versions get to play more of it. Tarfire can be a good spell in that spot because it both acts as a removal spell and helps turn on Traverse, or grows your Tarmogoyf so that instead of trading it can block profitably. So the more aggressive shadow builds can do it. It's just a little more intricate.
Right. So, speaking on the Traverse side, what kind of person is this deck for? If you're interested in getting into Modern, who would you be telling this deck is for?
So it's actually closer to like a Zoo deck than the other Shadow decks are. So if you're a person that likes disruptive aggro decks, Traverse Shadow is perfect for you.
It's basically an evolution of that. What was it called? It was originally called Suicide Zoo.
Yeah, that deck led into a few different Shadow decks. Because it originally it was like the blue Suicide Zoo deck, and then it led into Jund Shadow, which led into Grixis Shadow, and then Jund Shadow splintered off again as people wanted to get more aggressive. So if you are like I said, a disruptive aggro player at heart. It's a great deck to pick up if you like Jund style strategies and enjoy winning more than you would with normal Jund. You might want to look into that one. It's funny. I have a couple of close friends that are Jund players that I have been working on converting.
Right.
But yeah, I think the disruptive aggro player is the primary market for something like Jund Shadow.
Excellent. So if you are interested in becoming a Death Shadow player, or particularly if you want to go in the Traverse build, maybe that's the type of deck for you. Do you have anything to say about your victory at Grand Prix Toronto? That was pretty recent. That was this year.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a friend about that earlier today. The commentary was, "Wow, the year has gone by so fast," and I was like, honestly, I think that I won a Grand Prix earlier this year, and it feels like it's been years.
With the metagame, how many times it changed over this year, it does feel like years.
For real. I think that, I mean, it was surreal, right? Like, every competitive Magic player wants to win a Grand Prix. Every competitive Magic player, wants to go to the Pro Tour, and I got to accomplish both of those things in the same afternoon. So that was super cool. Kind of was a jumping off point to what I'm going to call a small content creation journey thus far, though I'm excited as it grows every day. And honestly, if you asked me, a year ago whether I thought anything like this would happen, my answer would be no. So it's honestly pretty cool to have opportunities to talk with a variety of people and discuss Magic on a higher level, and even get into content creation, do interviews like this. It's all it's still honestly a pretty surreal opportunity.
Well, good for you. I'm glad that you not only won Grand Prix Toronto, but you're also sticking with the deck and in depth teaching the community and helping other people become much better Death Shadow players. So one of the main reasons I really like Modern over, say, something like Standard, where people promote a deck for like 2 weeks and then dump it when they think something else is better.
Yeah, you really get to attach yourself to certain strategies in Modern and grow and develop as those decks grow and develop, which is certainly a thing that I enjoy about the format. You get that in like Legacy as well, but obviously Modern is much, much more accessible.
Much more accessible? More Grand Prix?
Yep.
Modern's got it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's my favorite format. It is, of seemingly a fan favorite among, Grand Prix formats. So, as long as Modern is here to stay, I am here to stay with Modern.
So, Michael, where can people find you? If they want to learn more about Death Shadow, you're a wealth of information. How can people find you?
So the easiest ways to do that are Twitter at RapaciousOne, Facebook at Michael Rapp, and I have a Discord that the easiest way to find a link to outside of PMing me is in my pinned tweet.
Right, okay.
Those are my three biggest Shadow content platforms. I'm always happy to chat if people want to DM me and ask me questions. I offer Shadow coaching if that's something that people are interested in when they're trying to get better. I write about Shadow occasionally at blog.cardkingdom.com. I'm trying to think if I'm working on a YouTube channel.
He's working on it. Maybe by the time you see this, it's already in existence.
Yeah, honestly, it is me being kind of lazy. I have some Twitch VODs that I want to upload so people can, so they have a little bit of I don't know if that's a word. So I can archive them a little better.
Yeah, there you go. You already made the video anyway.
Yeah. I do stream, usually Friday evenings, twitch.tv/rapacious1, same as my my Twitter at. I think that is it.
By the way, all links are gonna be found in the description below, so don't worry, you don't have to be like, I don't know, jotting down notes.
Yeah, all of my social media links are also in my pinned tweet. If you find me on Twitter, you can find me on everywhere else.
Excellent. Anyway, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview. I think a lot of people learned a lot of stuff about, the Shadow variants other than Grixis Shadow that do not get as much spotlight as Grixis Shadow always does. Do you have any other words before we finish?
Other than thank you for having me, and hopefully, this is helpful to people that are looking to get into the Shadow archetype. As I said earlier, I'm always happy to chat. If you want to send me a DM, join the Discord. There are always people chatting about the deck there.
Get involved in the community.
Yes, exactly. We want more people, please. But yeah, it is mostly thank you for having me, and hopefully this is helpful to any aspiring Shadow players.
You're welcome. So anyway, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, if you want to see more of these Masters Mondays, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Give a like if you love this interview. So, we're going to sign off. This has been Nikachu with Grixis, Death Shadow Master Michael Rapp, talking about Shadow in Modern.